You don't remember your mother. You remember the clang of steel, the weight of buckets, and the damp straw where squires slept in rows like harvest. But you do remember the first time you saw him. He was 12, maybe 13. Not quite tall enough to command attention, yet somehow the room turned toward him when he stepped in. Hair the color of winter fire, eyes like polished copper coins, and silence, not fear, but gravity, followed him into the stone hall like a scent. They called him Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, but the old men whispered another name, Le Petit Lion. You were barely a boy yourself, just another servant, another shadow, barefoot and bone-thin. Your hands were cracked from carrying buckets up and down the spiral stairs of Poitiers Castle. But one day he looked at you, really looked, and handed you his training sword. "Hold it," he said. "Don't drop it, even if you bleed." You held it. It was heavier than you expected. Not just the blade, but everything it stood for. From that day, you weren't just a boy in the walls. You were his boy. The palace in Poitiers stank of wet dog, stew, and ambition. Every corridor was lined with watching eyes. Nobles in velvet, knights in chainmail, guards in boredom. Richard, still not yet king, was surrounded by danger long before he held a blade in battle. His father, Henry II of England, ruled a scattered empire, too large for one mind and too hungry for one family. And his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, she burned like something holy. Beautiful, yes, but sharper than any man in her orbit. She spoke 3 languages and could ride a horse harder than most knights. She once led a crusade dressed in armor. When Richard walked, it was in her stride. When he looked at maps, it was with her hunger. You saw him at night sometimes, in the candlelight, tracing his finger along the edge of the known world. Not toward England, but east, always east. "Why there?" you once asked. He shrugged. "That's where God hides the truth." You didn't understand, but you memorized the way he said it. He trained like a creature with no sense of limitation. Sword at dawn, horse at noon, bow at dusk. Even as a teenager, he sparred against grown men, blooding his knuckles, cracking ribs, his or theirs, it didn't seem to matter. You followed. You cleaned his armor with vinegar and wool. You wiped his boots, patched the inside of his gloves when they blistered his palms. And you listened to the shouting behind stone doors when Henry argued with Eleanor, to the silence when Richard came back with bruises beneath his tunic and didn't speak for hours, to the rumors, always whispered, of John, the youngest brother, sneaking messages to his father. You didn't know politics. You knew the weight of wet leather. You knew how to rub salt from chainmail before it rotted. But even you could see it. The family was a war. The kingdom just hadn't noticed yet. One night, a comet blazed across the sky. You stood outside the armory while Richard and his men drank and boasted. He stepped away, alone, watching the fire trail across the blackness. "Do you think kings go to heaven?" he asked quietly. You stammered something. I don't know, my lord." He smiled without warmth. "Me neither." Then he handed you his sword, real this time, not the training blade. It was warm from his hand. He didn't say why. But you held it, even though you bled. And that's when it truly began. Not with a coronation, not with a conquest, but with a gesture. A boy giving another boy a blade. Because even lions need someone to carry the weight when the roar grows too heavy. And you, nameless, faceless, you became that someone. Forever walking 6 steps behind. Through blood, through mud, through the silence between victories. Until the world began calling him something else. Not just Richard, but Lionheart. The first thing you learn in royal service isn't how to bow. It's how to listen without being seen. And it's in the dark, behind tapestries and half-shut doors, that you first hear the true voice of the Angevin throne. It doesn't sound like glory. It sounds like teeth grinding. King Henry II, Richard's father, was a man who loved his children like a lion loves his cubs, hungrily, conditionally, and always in preparation for war. He had 4 sons and no peace. Henry the young king, golden and loved by the people, died early. Geoffrey, clever but slippery, would follow him soon after, trampled beneath the politics he wove too tightly. Richard, sharp as a sword and twice as cold. And John, youngest, smallest, always reaching for more than he deserved. Henry would say to Richard, "Your mother spoils you. You dream too loud." And to John, "You will never be half the man your brother is, but perhaps you will survive him." You saw them all once, together, during a rare family hunt in Anjou. Richard, 17, already broad in the shoulders, already sure he would be king of something. John, 10, riding a pony too big for him, teeth clenched, fists white. Their father watched from horseback, eyes like sharpened coins. At one point, John tried to cut ahead on the trail. Richard blocked him. Their horses reared, snorted. A pause. Then Richard leaned in and whispered something that made John turn red with fury. Later, by the fire, you overheard John muttering to a page, "Someday I'll bury him, alive, if I must." You didn't tell anyone, because you were already learning. In this family, truth was more dangerous than treason. Richard, meanwhile, began to rule Aquitaine in his own way, not with softness, not with charm, but with fire and steel. There were rebellions in the south, barons who claimed Eleanor had poisoned their wine with foreign tongues. Richard crushed them, burned castles, hanged sons and fathers both. You helped bandage his hand once after a siege. He'd split his knuckles open, punching a stone wall in frustration. He looked at you while you wrapped it. If I must kill half of Aquitaine to keep the other half loyal, he said, then I'll sleep in a palace of bones. You didn't answer, because part of you believed he meant it. Still, his father never named him heir, not truly. Henry dangled the crown like a bauble, teasing each son in turn. And that bait turned into civil war. In 1173, Richard allied with his brothers against their father. Eleanor herself, Richard's mother, joined the conspiracy. The king crushed it, imprisoned Eleanor for years, made Richard kneel for forgiveness. But you were there, standing behind him as he knelt, and you saw the way his hands curled into fists behind his back. He wasn't begging. He was memorizing the moment. Years passed. Battles, truces, more betrayals. By 1189, Richard had had enough. He gathered his forces, made peace with Philip of France, his longtime rival, and turned his sword toward his own father. You weren't in the final room when Henry II collapsed, but you were there outside. You saw the blood on the messenger's scroll. You saw the fury in the eyes of the guards. When the king's corpse was laid in the abbey, someone said they found a list in his hand, a list of names. And John was on it, with the word betrayer beside him. Richard wept that night, but not for grief. You saw it, quiet, alone in the chapel. The tears were cold. He wasn't mourning his father. He was mourning that he hadn't killed him sooner. And so he became king. But the throne wasn't warm. It was a blade. And every brother who had touched it before had bled out. He sat down anyway, because lions don't ask who died before them. They simply roar. Aquitaine was never his birthright. It was his mother's dowry, a kingdom of sun-drenched vineyards, stubborn barons, and voices that hummed in Languedoc like bees in summer air. But it didn't love him. Not at first. They called him an English wolf in a French cradle. Too harsh, too northern, too war-thirsty. Even though he was born in Oxford, Richard had lived most of his youth in the stone keeps and iron chapels of Aquitaine. He spoke their tongue, drank their wine, rode their roads. But he ruled like a hammer, not a harp. And hammers don't earn love. They take silence by force. You saw it begin with fire. One by one, rebellious lords refused to kneel. So he burned them. Not metaphorically. Real fire. You remember the siege at Castillon-sur-Agen. The castle perched high, smug on its limestone cliff. Richard ordered sappers beneath the outer wall.
You carried oil to the tunnels by night, reeking and half blind. When the fire caught, it didn't roar. It shrieked. Stone moaned like wounded oxen. The tower cracked like God's own knuckles. You looked up and saw him silhouetted on the ridge, watching it fall. No cheer, no smugness, just inevitability. Like a king cutting his own infected hand. They surrendered. Of course they did. But Richard didn't celebrate. He ordered the prisoners marched out in silence. Some were executed, some were blinded. All were left knowing this: the Duke of Aquitaine does not ask twice. That night you washed the blood from his boots. He didn't speak, but as you worked, he murmured, "Kindness is a crown of thorns." You said nothing, but you remembered the way he pressed his thumb into his own palm afterward until it bled, as if to remind himself that pain and kingship were always twins. Later came the troubadours. Yes, Richard wrote poetry. Yes, he sang. But don't be fooled. He didn't do it to feel. He did it to control feeling, to wrap grief in rhyme, to sharpen memory into blade song. You heard one verse sung late by the fire when he thought no one listened. The torch I carry burns too clean. It scalds the hand, not yet the heart. And all who follow learn too late. The fire was justice from the start. You understood none of it, but you remember how the flame crackled in his eyes when he finished. One spring morning, a noblewoman came, tall, veiled, with a ring of sapphire as large as a holy wafer. You never learned her name, but Richard kissed her gloved hand, and afterward he sat silent for 3 hours, sharpening his dagger to a whisper. That evening he ordered the walls of her father's fortress torn down stone by stone, though the man had already surrendered. You asked why. He said, because he taught her to kneel. This was Richard before Jerusalem, before the cross, before history painted him in sainted light. A warrior duke with too much fire in his belly and too little patience in his bones. And yet, they followed him. They sang of him, not because he was gentle, but because he was never afraid. And in an age of shifting thrones and flaccid kings, that counted for more than love. You still have the scar on your arm from a siege ladder's splinter. You'd slipped while following him up the wall of St. Macar. He didn't stop, but after the city fell, he found you, pressed a coin into your palm. Pain, he said, makes the best memories. You never spent that coin. You still feel it, even now, like a small circular wound, still warm.
They say some kings take the cross for God. Richard took it for revenge. It was 1187 when the world changed. News came not on angels' wings, but by courier, sweating, pale,
half dead from the ride across France. Jerusalem had fallen. The holy city, where Christ was crowned with thorns and Rome with memory, had fallen to Saladin. Not just fallen, surrendered. Christian blood soaked the stones. The relics, the true cross itself, carried off like spoils. You were there, just a shadow in a hall of furs and armor, when Richard read the scroll. He said nothing at first, just stood, turned to the window, and whispered, "They gave away heaven." That same night he called his captains. He ordered horses, smiths, ships. He knelt before the bishop in a chapel lit only by tallow and rain light. And he took the cross, a strip of red silk, not worn on his back, but across his chest, like a wound that hadn't happened yet. You helped fasten it. Your hands shook. His didn't. Others followed. Philip of France took the cross too, though some said he did it out of envy, not piety. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany joined as well, a man so old his armor looked tired. It would be called the Third Crusade. But among the common folk, they named it something darker, the King's Crusade. Because this time it wasn't for relics, it was for blood. Preparations took a year. You watched Richard melt down silverware to forge helmets. You watched priests bless swords as if that made them less cruel. You helped count barrels of salt pork, dried beans, black bread, water casks. You watched men pray before boarding ships, and then vomit over the rail once the waves turned savage. And always behind it all, the map. Pinned above Richard's cot, Jerusalem circled in charcoal, like the pupil of God's own eye. He left his kingdom to barons he didn't trust, and a brother he didn't love. Before departing, he told one adviser, "If I die, bury my body where it falls, but send my heart to Jerusalem." You thought it poetry. Later, you'd learn he meant it literally. The voyage to the Holy Land was not holy. Storms, diseases, pirates, even the wine turned sour. But he endured. When half the army begged to turn back, Richard told them, "The seas do not scare me. I have nothing left to lose but sin." And they followed. Because even in filth, even in thirst, even in fever, Richard never looked back. He was already dreaming in stone and sand and martyrdom, already imagining the city gates, already measuring how many men he'd have to kill to unlock them. One morning, as they neared Cyprus, you found him alone, washing his sword in seawater. "Does God see this?" you asked. He stared at the horizon. "No," he said. "God watches the survivors." You didn't understand then, but you would. Because war makes faith simple and cruelty practical. Acre. Not yet a city. Not anymore a fortress. just a rot-stained graveyard where men died waiting for their turn to kill. By the time Richard's ships carved through the eastern wind and dropped anchor before the coast, the siege had already been dragging on for nearly 2 years. The crusaders who had come before him were broken, some without shoes, some without eyes, many without faith. Their camp stretched like a leper's belt around the stone carcass of Acre's walls. Tents sagged like dying lungs. The air stank of rot, wine, and prayers no one bothered to finish. You arrived with Richard on a cloudless morning, and when he stepped off the galley, everything paused. Not because he was king, not because he wore gold, but because he wore steel that sang when he moved, because his eyes didn't flicker like the others, because behind him came a line of men who didn't shuffle, didn't whimper, didn't look to heaven. They looked at the walls, like wolves at a butcher's door. Richard surveyed the battlefield like a mason surveying broken stone. He spoke little. He only said, "We'll take the gate, and when the gate falls, the city follows." And so it began again. You watched him build towers higher than the old siege engines. He didn't trust what the other kings had left behind. He wanted his own. He brought engineers from Sicily, sappers from Flanders, archers from Poitiers, crossbowmen from Normandy, and every nail, every stone, every rope you carried. Your hands blistered, your skin cracked from the salt wind and sun. You worked beside men who spoke no common tongue, but all knew one word, Acre. And every morning they whispered it like a curse. The walls answered back, with fire, with boiling oil, with arrows so thin and fast they sounded like angry bees. You dragged bodies from the wreckage, and sometimes pieces. A hand still gripping a sword, a foot in a boot, twitching. One day, a boy no older than 13 stumbled back to camp carrying his brother's severed head. He didn't cry. He just laid it on a stone, like it might still speak. Inside his tent, Richard remained calm, unnaturally so. Each evening, you undressed his armor, piece by piece, like a priest removing relics. He bore scratches, bruises, but never flinched. Once you saw him studying a letter by candlelight. It bore Saladin's seal. You couldn't read the Arabic, but you saw the corners of Richard's mouth twitch. "A clever man," he muttered. "Shame about the religion." Then he poured wine on the letter and burned it. When Acre finally cracked, it wasn't with a trumpet. It wasn't with a miracle. It fell like a fever breaking, slow, hot, inevitable. Richard rode through the splintered gate with sunlight turning his blade to flame. The city was half dead already, but that didn't matter. He had entered, and for a moment he was untouchable. The prisoners, Muslim soldiers and civilians alike, were marched out for exchange. Saladin delayed. Too long. Richard waited a week, then ordered 2,700 captives executed before the walls. You stood behind him, handing out swords. Even children, even clerks, even women who had washed the streets. He didn't blink. When it was done, he said, "This is mercy. Now Saladin knows what happens when I wait." That night, no one sang. Even the rats scurried quieter. You lay in your blanket, unable to sleep, and you realized something terrifying. Richard wasn't here to reclaim the Holy Land. He was here to rewrite the scripture in blood.
War, when it's written in books, sounds like drums and banners. But at Arsuf, it sounded like bones snapping beneath hooves. You marched south along the coast, from Acre to Jaffa, each step sinking into sand and sweat. The heat clung to you like a second skin, rank, suffocating, holy in its cruelty. Richard led from the front. No golden throne, no shaded litter, just a white surcoat marked with a red cross, more crimson now than ever. Saladin followed like a wolf. For days his cavalry shadowed the column, too fast to pin down, too patient to flee. They struck like lightning. Arrows screamed from dunes, slicing men from their saddles. Water wagons were pierced. Priests bled beside pikemen. The Saracens vanished before you could curse them. Still, you marched. Every man blistered, burnt, limping, but moving. Richard allowed no delay. He knew. He wanted Saladin to attack. And on the 7th day, he did. Arsuf, a flat stretch of dust and death. Pine trees in the distance, the sea to your right, and to your left, hell. Saladin's cavalry came like a scream, curved blades flashing in the sun, trumpets blaring like laughter. Arrows blackened the sky. The Hospitallers, riding in the rear, were nearly overrun. Their commander begged to charge. Richard refused. "Not yet," he said. Another volley. More bodies. Not yet. A second plea. A third. Finally, his voice. Now. What happened next has been carved into church walls and barred songs. You lived it. You watched Richard mount his destrier like he was born in the saddle, lance raised, face expressionless. He didn't shout. He simply pointed, and then charged. The earth shook. Metal screamed. The Christian line uncoiled like a slingshot from heaven. You ran to keep up, sword in hand, mouth full of sand, ears deafened by hooves. And in the midst of it, him, Richard, standing in his stirrups, blade wheeling like light. He didn't just fight. He conducted violence. One stroke severed a man in two. Another
cracked through shield and skull. Blood sprayed in arcs so wide it painted crosses in the air. He fought beside the French, beside the Templars, beside the men whose names history forgot. And not once did he retreat. They say he fought in front of the banner, so his men had to follow, or die looking at his back. Saladin's men broke like waves. By sundown, the dunes were littered with turbans, limbs, and arrows sunk so deep they stood upright. You helped drag the wounded. You poured water into mouths that didn't close. That night, a young knight whispered, "God fights through him." You looked at Richard, bent over a map, armor still smeared with red, not his own. And you thought, no, God watches him and takes notes. The following day, Richard buried the dead with his own hands. He kissed the forehead of a fallen squire, and then mounted up again. No prayer, just a nod toward the south, toward Jerusalem. But something had changed, in him, in all of you. Because at Arsuf, it wasn't the Holy Land you tasted. It was power. And the terrifying question that crawled behind your ribs, what if we don't deserve heaven? What if we only know how to conquer it?
Jerusalem shimmered on the horizon. You saw it once, just once, when the clouds pulled back like curtains on a stage, and the golden dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque flashed in the sunlight like the eye of a watching God. Richard didn't move. He just looked and said, "Beautiful, we will not take it." It shocked the men. It shocked you. After all the blood, the storms, the burned cities and butchered prisoners, was he giving up? But it wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Because Jerusalem could be reached, but it could not be held. Not with poisoned wells, not with Saladin's army circling like vultures, not when reinforcements from Europe were drying up like the desert wind. Richard wasn't here to die for a rock. He was here to make history kneel. And for that, he needed something more dangerous than a sword. He needed diplomacy. Enter Saladin, the Sultan who had taken Jerusalem, shattered crusader armies, and still managed to be admired by his enemies. He didn't hide in castles. He wrote letters, elegant, venom-laced, strangely respectful letters. Richard replied in kind. They praised each other's honor, mocked each other's tactics, sent each other gifts, horses, fruit, even snow from Mount Lebanon packed in cloth to cool the fevered English king. You delivered some of those parcels. Once you entered a tent where a Muslim envoy handed you a scroll sealed in green wax. The parchment crackled like dry leaves. You didn't read Arabic, but the man smiled at you, not cruelly. "Tell your king," he said, "the lion is not our enemy, only the heat." Behind closed tents, the real war began. Saladin wanted peace, but on his terms. Richard wanted Jerusalem, but alive, not legendary. They met only once, indirectly,
through Saladin's brother Al-Adil, known to you as Safaddin. Richard liked him, more than he liked most of his barons. He joked, half serious, about marrying his sister Joanna to Al-Adil, sealing a Christian-Muslim alliance. They even discussed sharing Jerusalem. 2 religions, 1 city. A dream made of sand and blood. It didn't last. No one in Europe would bless such a union. But still, Richard tried. And that said something about the man who once butchered prisoners outside Acre. That perhaps, somewhere beneath the iron, there was still a prince who understood the limits of fire. One night, you found him pacing outside his tent, barefoot. He looked up at the stars and said, "Tell me, why is it that my enemies have more honor than my friends?" You didn't answer, but you wanted to say, "Because your enemies never tried to wear your crown." Meanwhile, back in England, his brother John was already scheming. Rumors bled across the sea like wine through linen. John taxing nobles, John selling castles, John whispering with Philip of France. Richard shrugged. If he wants the throne, he can have the damn thing, but only if he digs it from beneath my bones. Eventually, the talks with Saladin bore fruit. In September 1192, the 2 leaders signed a truce. Christians could visit Jerusalem as pilgrims. Saladin would hold the city. Coastal crusader towns remained in Christian hands. The war was over. Not with a bang, but with a bow. And no one cheered. As Richard prepared to leave, he mounted his horse near Jaffa, looked one last time to the east. He whispered, not to you, not to God, maybe to the sand. I came for a crown of thorns, and found only salt. You followed him down the coast, toward the sea, toward a ship that would never reach England, because fate was sharpening a different dagger, and it had his name etched deep in the hilt.
Kings aren't supposed to vanish. But Richard did. Twice. First from the Holy Land, then from the maps altogether. He left Jerusalem not in triumph, but in silence. Not to parades, but to murmurs. Not to England, but to danger. Because the road home was not his own. His enemies had been waiting. Philip of France sent word ahead. Beware the lion. He limps, but his teeth remain sharp. And John, Richard's brother, wrote letters in ink blacker than loyalty, whispering treason into every court that would listen. Every kingdom between Palestine and England became a possible noose. Richard tried to travel in disguise. A poor knight, a merchant, even, some say, a common cook. But even in rags, Richard could not stop being Richard. He tipped too much, spoke too well, moved like someone who never learned to kneel. It was winter
1192, in Austria, when they caught him. In a tavern near Vienna, a local baron noticed the merchant spoke Latin with a French accent, that his hands bore the scars of someone who had worn a sword since boyhood, that his ring, hidden under cloth, bore the Plantagenet crest. The lion was unmasked and shackled. They took him in chains to Leopold of Austria, who hated Richard for mocking him at Acre, then sold him to Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire, who hated him for being too beloved. They say he was kept in Dürnstein Castle, in a room of stone and shadow, high above the Danube. No sunlight, no heralds, no crown. Just Richard, his hands, and his voice. Because even there he sang ballads of his homeland, verses of lost love and broken crusades, a song in Languedoc so sweet and so sorrowful, it drifted through the cracks in the stone down to the vineyards below. And one day, a minstrel heard it. The legend says his name was Blondel, a troubadour loyal to Richard, searching castle after castle. When he heard that voice, he sang back the second verse. And from within the stone tower, Richard replied. True or not, the song spread faster than his jailers expected, and suddenly Europe remembered. The lion had not died. He was caged. And a caged lion is more dangerous than a dead one. Back in England, John tried to take the throne. He taxed, schemed, tried to convince barons that Richard would never return. But when news of the imprisonment broke, everything shifted. Pope Celestine III excommunicated those who held Richard. Bards sang protest songs in London streets. Eleanor of Aquitaine, his indomitable mother, gathered 150,000 silver marks for his ransom, the largest ever demanded. A king's worth in silver, enough to fund another war, or a dozen. You were there when they opened the gates. He walked out not as a ghost, but as a myth resurrected. Thinner, grayer, but burning, like an ember that refused to die. He said nothing for hours. Then, finally, to you, God has a sense of humor. You looked down at the chains still dragging behind him and asked, "Do they still hurt?" He smiled. "No, they sing." Because for Richard, even humiliation became legend. Even captivity became part of the roar. And the next sound Europe would hear would be his sword. England welcomed him like a long-lost son. Trumpets, banners, coins struck with his face. The lion was back. But you knew the truth. Richard didn't return to rule England. He returned to punish it. He had been gone for nearly 5 years. 5 years of barons shifting their loyalties like dice. 5 years of John, his youngest brother, crawling over the throne with claws disguised as parchment. 5 years of sold forests, looted treasuries, castles bought and sold like livestock. And now here he stood, crowned again, though the gold felt heavier, though his smile was thinner. He walked through Winchester, through Westminster, through the marble corridors of power, like a man looking for traitors beneath the flagstones. And, in truth, they were everywhere. You helped sort his correspondence. Every morning, scrolls from France, from the church, from castles on the Scottish border. Every evening, letters from nobles, lords, wives, begging for favor, bribes wrapped in prose. Some he read, some he burned. Some he handed to you with that simple command. This one, fire. You never asked why, but you began to notice the ones he burned were often the most poetic, the ones that pleaded too perfectly, the ones written in ink that smelled like perfume. Once you read one by mistake. It spoke of eternal loyalty and brotherhood of blood. It was signed Johannes. You burned it before Richard could. And you never told him, because you saw the way his jaw tightened whenever someone said, "your brother," as if the word itself was a curse. Still, he didn't execute John. He didn't strip his lands. He didn't send him to the gallows. He did something crueler. He forgave him in public. A royal gesture, a pageantry of mercy. But in private, he said nothing. He simply ordered John to serve him on campaign, to march beside him, to sleep under the same tents, to taste every meal after Richard did, like a brother or a leash. England was not enough for Richard. He didn't want to rule sheep. He wanted lions. And lions needed to conquer. So, not even a year after returning, he crossed the Channel again, back to France, back to war, because the old wounds had not healed, because Philip of France had not forgotten, and because Richard's greatest fear wasn't death. It was boredom. You remember his final counsel before departure. Candles flickering, maps unfolded. He turned to his captains and said, "I have forgiven my enemies, but my sword remembers everything." You packed his mail. You carried his armor. You burned his secrets. And some nights, when the wind howled through the towers, You'd swear you heard the paper crying in the hearth, not from fire, but from the weight of what had almost happened. The throne that nearly changed hands, the blood that nearly ran too deep, and a brother who had once whispered your name in kindness, but would have sold it for a crown. Still, Richard pressed forward, not because he trusted the world, but because he trusted his blade. And you followed, because you had already burned everything else.
War had become routine. By 1199, Richard was no longer fighting for salvation, glory, or kingship. He was fighting out of habit. The campaign was small by his standards. A border skirmish in Limousin, near the obscure castle of Chalus-Chabrol. The kind of place no one remembered, until history bled on its stones. The lord there had refused tribute, a petty insult. And Richard, who once challenged empires, now rode to break the will of a minor nobleman. You begged him to send another. He laughed. "I have time," he said. But kings rarely do. The castle was barely defended. Just a few men. No army, no threat. But Richard, ever restless, ordered a siege. A lazy one. He didn't wear full armor. He strolled the perimeter as if walking through memory. And then, from the battlements, a single arrow, fired by a boy. Bertrand, they said, just a child. It struck Richard beneath the left shoulder, where the mail had parted. He didn't fall, not immediately. He just grunted, turned, laughed, and said, "Well shot." You rushed to him, helped him down, pressed cloth to the wound. He winced, only slightly, said, "Tell the surgeon to sharpen his knife. I don't want to die of his clumsiness." You forced a smile, but your hands were already red, and the cloth kept blooming like a rose. The arrow came out 2 days later, infected. The surgeon was careful. Richard joked through it, teeth gritted, calling the man a goat in boots. But you saw the fever behind his eyes, the sweat, the shaking. It wasn't the wound that killed him. It was the infection, the slow black rot that crawled beneath his ribs. And for the first time, you saw him afraid, not of dying, but of dying slowly. He summoned his mother. Eleanor came like a storm, with gray in her hair and fire in her spine. She held his hand, kissed his brow, whispered old songs from Aquitaine, and he smiled. Even then, he smiled. He summoned the boy, the archer. Bertrand was dragged in, weeping, shaking, barely taller than a spear. You expected fury, execution. But Richard said only, "Live." He gave the boy money, forgiveness. "Let him go," he said. "It was a good shot."
You stayed beside him until the end. His skin yellowed, his voice turned to smoke. But even in the last hours, he whispered, "I feel no pain, only time. So much time I didn't use." On April 6th, 1199, at the age of 41, Richard I, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Lord of Aquitaine, died. Not in battle, not in Jerusalem, but in a bed, in a room that smelled of vinegar and prayer. His horse was led past the window. It reared once, let out a high, strange cry. The stable boys said it sounded like weeping. And maybe it was, because kings don't cry, but their horses remember the weight of their masters. You washed his body. You placed the coin over each eye. You wrapped the heart in cloth and sealed it for ruin. The entrails were buried at Chalus, the rest of him at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father, the man he fought, the man who never crowned him, and now lay still beside him. You remained behind, not because you were commanded, but because you no longer knew where else to go. A lion's roar echoes, but the forest eventually grows quiet. And you are the silence that follows it.
You rode north alone, not as a knight, not even as a servant, just a figure in a torn cloak, carrying a sealed heart in a cedar box. Richard's heart, wrapped in linen soaked in herbs, smelling faintly of rose oil and iron. The road to Rouen was cold and soft underfoot. Spring had come late that year, and the rivers were still fat with meltwater. Each village you passed knew the news before you spoke. They bowed, crossed themselves. Some wept, but none were surprised, because kings are not built to last. Only the stories of kings. You reached Notre Dame of Rouen, and the priests met you in silence. They didn't ask to open the box. They knew. The bishop held it high before the altar, chanted something you didn't catch, and placed it in a silver casket too small for the weight it carried. They buried it beneath the choir, with marble, with Latin, with reverence. But when you passed the tomb later that night, you noticed the candles were cold, and the incense had gone out. You rode on to Fontevraud Abbey, where his mother had chosen to place the rest of his body, a place of women, of silence, of penance. You found Eleanor already there, older than you remembered, bent but not broken. She stood over the stone effigy they'd carved for her son. The sculptor had made him look peaceful, too peaceful. He had never looked that way in life. You wanted to say so, but Eleanor's eyes found yours, and in that moment
you said nothing, because she already knew. That night you wandered the abbey, and there, behind a half-sealed door, you found a room of scrolls, not Bibles, not psalters, but records of the crusade, the negotiations at Acre, the letters from Saladin, the Song of Blondel, the treaties never signed. The pages were yellowed, brittle, warm to the touch. You opened one, read a passage. He commanded not for heaven's sake, but because the silence of the world offended him. You closed it, set it back, and stared into the dark. The abbess found you an hour later. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. You asked her, why hide the truth? She smiled, because no one dreams of truth. They buried him beside Henry II, and later Eleanor herself would be placed beside them. Father, son, mother. 3 tempests frozen in limestone. 3 myths laid out like relics, but not together. Not really. Because they had never been a family, only a dynasty. You spent the next week sleeping beneath the cloister arches, dreaming of sand, of arrows, of the sound Richard made when he lifted his sword, not the roar, but the breath before it, the stillness, the part no one writes about. One day, a monk asked your name. You lied, because what name could you give? You had none anymore, only a role, to remember what the statues had forgotten, to carry the burden that even stone couldn't hold. Richard was dead, but the silence after his death, it was louder than any battle, and deeper than any prayer.
There are many versions of how he died. Some say he bled, cursing. Others say he whispered prayers. But you were there, and you remember the smile. Not wide, not joyful, not even kind, but tired, almost grateful, as if for once the ending had arrived on time. It wasn't a noble death, not like the poets would later sing. There was no Saracen blade, no glorious duel beneath the golden dome of Jerusalem. Just a rusted arrow from the ramparts of a provincial castle. Chalus Chabrol, a name no one had spoken before, a place that didn't deserve his blood, but took it anyway. The wound was deep, but not instantly fatal, and so he lingered, fevered, fading, full of unfinished words. You brought him water, sat through the night, and listened as he drifted
in and out of the fog. He spoke of Eleanor, of Jerusalem, of a river in Aquitaine where he once chased frogs barefoot, of John, and then of you, not by name, but by shape. He said, "There's a shadow that's always walked beside me, quieter than death, louder than memory." You didn't reply, because what do you say to a king who spent his life roaring and now finally learns how to whisper? He forgave the boy, Bertrand. He didn't have to. No one would have blamed him for ordering the child flayed, broken, hung. But he only said, "Let him go. Tell him it was a good shot, and that I smile when I fall." That moment, that mercy, it didn't match the man who ordered the beheading of 2,700 prisoners outside Acre. But it belonged to him, as much as the sword, as much as the war, as much as the legend. Because Richard wasn't contradiction. He was human, and no human fits neatly into a hymn. They embalmed him, split his body. The guts stayed at Chalus. The heart went to Rouen, the bones to Fontevraud, scattered across the map like pieces of a puzzle no one could finish, as if even in death he refused to belong to one place, one cause, one myth. The priests argued over how to write his epitaph. Here lies a king. Here lies the Lionheart. Here lies a sinner. In the end, they chose Latin, which hid all meanings equally. But you remember the smile. And you remember the silence that came after, like the air had exhaled, like the earth itself had leaned forward, and then sat back, quietly. You carried the blood-stained surcoat for years, not because it was sacred, but because you didn't know what else to carry. When people asked who you were, you'd say nothing, just nod and walk on. Because what do you call yourself when the roar has ended and you're still listening for the echo?
Kings are not supposed to scatter. But Richard did. Not by will, but by tradition, by politics, by myth. You watched as they laid out the parts, each wrapped in cloth, each marked not by name, but by destination. It felt more like shipping relics than honoring a man. The entrails stayed at Chalus, a gesture to the land where he fell, a local chapel, a hurried burial. The priest didn't even say his name, only noble blood. You remember the flies. You remember the smell. And you remember thinking, this is where the legend starts to rot. The heart was next. You rode with it to Rouen, the capital of Normandy. A procession quiet and tight. Priests, knights, pages. You held the box as if it could break, but it was already broken. Inside, his heart had been embalmed in frankincense, myrrh, daisies, mint, and honey, as if the sweetness could disguise the war it once pumped. At Notre Dame, they placed it beneath the altar. There were hymns, Latin chants, bells rung low and long. But still, you noticed, the people outside whispered less of heaven and more of revenge. Because a lion's heart is not a holy relic. It's a weapon, and no one knew what to do with a weapon they could no longer wield. Finally, his body, to Fontevraud Abbey, to be placed beside his father, Henry II, and later his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. A dynasty in marble, a family in stone. But if you've ever stood in that cold crypt, you'll understand. They do not face each other. They lie side by side, silent, still, not reconciled, just buried. The monks sang. The tomb was sealed. The banners folded. And outside the abbey, the wind moved through the trees like a sigh that had been waiting too long. Years passed. You stayed, not as a knight, not even as a servant. You swept the cloisters, lit candles, watched dust gather on the slab marked Ricardus Rex Anglorum, and you listened to the schoolchildren mispronounce his name. One day a traveler asked, "Was he a good king?" You didn't answer. You just showed him the empty hand on the statue, where the sword once was, stolen, forgotten, filed down into something less sharp. Because Richard wasn't good, wasn't bad. He was large, larger than England, larger than France, larger than the church that sang him to sleep, and too large to stay in one piece. So they broke him and called it reverence. But you remember the sound of his voice before battle, the laugh when his horse slipped in the mud, the way he whispered old verses to himself when he thought no one listened. And none of that is in the tomb. None of that is in the stone. Only you carry it now, and only you know. The heart may be buried, but the roar, it wanders. It wasn't death that shocked you. It was the silence that followed. You had spent decades beside a man whose very breath could fill a valley,
who spoke in orders, in iron, in scripture carved through mud. And now, the world didn't echo anymore. The courts moved on. The nobles reshuffled their loyalties like stained cards. John took the throne. John, the one who had waited like a shadow beneath the feast table, now wearing the crown like a borrowed coat. You attended his coronation, stood in the back of the cathedral, too close to the incense, too far from the light. When the choir sang Deus Vult, you looked at his face and saw a man who still flinched when someone dropped a goblet. You no longer had a title, no wages, no duty, but still you served. You swept the stones in Fontevraud, lit the candles over the tomb, wrote no letters, spoke no names. Each night you whispered to the lion and the dark, "I remember," not because he asked you to, but because no one else would. Sometimes travelers came. They'd kneel before his effigy, cross themselves, leave coins. One boy asked you, "Did he really eat hearts?" You smiled. "No, he broke them." Decades passed. Kings rose and fell. France burned. England forgot. And Jerusalem remained where it always was, too far, too holy, too unreachable. But you stayed, because you had seen something they hadn't. Not just the warrior, not just the king, but the man, who once stopped in the middle of a march to help a limping dog cross a bridge, who feared losing his voice more than losing his throne, who joked as his body failed that hell would refuse him for being too dramatic. No book tells that version, no sermon dares, but it is yours to hold, yours alone. And some nights, when the abbey is sleeping and the stars forget to blink, you feel it again. The wind, that old dry wind from the Holy Land, carrying dust, carrying memory, carrying something that still sounds like a roar. Because here's the secret no tomb will confess. Kings die, kingdoms fall, but those who remember, they choose what echoes. And you're not just a shadow. You're the echo's keeper, the last servant of a lion whose heart refused to stay buried.
Years no longer meant anything. Not to you, not to the stones beneath Fontevraud Abbey. The world blurred like the ink on a wet scroll. But still, you remembered. They say time erases all things, but memory has corners it forgets to dust. And in those corners, you remained.
not as a name, not as a monument, but as a man who once held his armor at dawn, who once burned the letters that could have destroyed kingdoms, who once stitched a wound into the skin of history and then walked on. You didn't write the chronicles. You weren't in the songs. Bards never asked for your side. But still, your truth flickered in the cracks between their rhymes. You heard them sing in taverns. Richard rode like thunder, with death clutched in his hand. He kissed the sword, not women, and bled upon the sand. But you knew better. You had seen him speak to children in the market, share bread with a deserter, cry once, when a war horse was put down. You had held the reins of a lion, not just the roar. Centuries passed. The abbey was sacked. The tombs were robbed. Revolution tore through France like fire through parchment. Richard's effigy was shattered, his face chipped by bayonets, his name scratched off coins, his bones moved, then lost. Even Eleanor's resting place was mocked, marble broken for gravel, silence turned to dust. But echoes? Echoes are stubborn things. They live in stone, in memory, in the spaces where stories should have died, but someone stayed to tell them. One winter, long after kings became parliaments and swords became museums, a young historian arrived. She found you tending the candles long forgotten in a corner of the crypt. She asked your name. You gave her another's. She asked about Richard. You said nothing. But before she left, you pressed a small coin into her palm. Silver, faintly rusted. The one Richard gave you all those lifetimes ago for bleeding at Castilian. She looked confused. You said only, "Pain makes the best memories." She returned to Paris and wrote a book. It didn't sell. But in the final chapter she wrote, "There was an old man in the shadows of Fontevraud. He spoke with his hands, and the way he lit the candles, it felt like he was still waiting for someone to come home." Now the abbey is clean, modern, with signs in 4 languages, guides in uniform. But beneath it all, behind a sealed panel near the crypt, there is still a box, wrapped in faded cloth. It holds nothing and everything. A letter, a bit of chain, a nail from a banner pole, and a note, unsigned. This is the sound he left behind. If you listen closely, just before sleep, you might still hear it. Not a voice, not a word, but something like breathing from a man who learned to die with his eyes open. You no longer wake. You are part of the stone now, part of the silence, but not lost, because someone Somewhere we'll ask again, was he truly a lion? And a voice will whisper back, no, he was a man, but I carried his roar.